Darkness took over the building. The caretaker, Carlos, walked through the silent corridors of an old commercial building, his footsteps muffled by the worn carpet covering the floor. The building, which used to be bustling during the day, was now dead, empty, its long corridors only filled with the echo of your own footsteps. He went from door to door, turning off lights, locking windows, as if he was extinguishing the last spark of life in that building. Each floor had its own sound, a faint electrical hum somewhere in the distance, the sound of water dripping from a solitary pipe, the wind coming in through the cracks of broken windows. It was always like this, at the end of the night. The building seemed to breathe with him, with his every step. Carlos approached the elevator, hearing the metallic sound of the doors closing as he pressed the button to go down to the next floor. The sound reverberated through the hall, almost like a sigh. He leaned back against the wall as the elevator slowly descended. The lights flickered, almost as if the building itself was tired of the night, trying to resist the monotony of emptiness. Carlos sighed, his eyes tired as he watched the lights on the dashboard. With each floor I descended, the feeling of loneliness intensified. The building, although large, was completely silent. The reception, which used to be busy during office hours, was now just an empty area, with the desk phone ringing occasionally, but never being answered. Carlos passed through reception, still with the feeling that something was just beyond his perception. The clock on the hall wall said 3 o'clock and 2 minutes in the morning. He glanced at the clock, the numbers illuminated by the dim light that still illuminated the room. He sighed, feeling the weight of past hours, of endless nights, another lonely night. He picked up his pen and marked his report. Another uneventful night. No news. The same routine that was repeated every week. He finished writing, and as he placed the report on the document shelf, he felt the weight of silence around him. The environment was too quiet, as if time itself had slowed down. He turned away from the table, taking in the building around him, now quieter than ever. He didn't know what was there, but something about those walls seemed to carry a strange feeling, as if the building was waiting for something. Carlos looked at his watch again. 3 hours and 2 minutes. He knew what that meant. Each night, at almost exactly this time, he would hear the phone at reception ring. But he never answered, always thinking it was some dialing error, a missed call from someone who forgot to hang up. But something worried him. He always felt a strange feeling in the air, a silent heaviness, as if the phone was calling to him, waiting for him to answer. But Carlos always ignored it. I didn't want to think about it. After all, he had been alone for hours, in a building he barely knew, and he knew that any thought out of the ordinary would only increase the discomfort of loneliness. The room was silent, with only the sound of Carlos's breathing filling the space as he walked through reception. The clock on the wall said 2 minutes past 3 in the morning, and the building was still in an almost ghostly state. Carlos looked at the landline phone on the reception desk. The display blinked once, then twice, and then, as always, the ringing sound cut through the stillness of the night. He looked up at the viewfinder. Room 908 was lit up. Carlos frowned, a slight discomfort passing through his body. Room 908 had been empty since the UAO company that occupied it went bankrupt 6 months ago. There shouldn't be anyone there. He looked at the phone for a moment, as if waiting for the sound to stop. The ringing persisted, a reminder of an interrupted routine, of something that seemed to make no sense. The phone rang again, insistently, and he finally decided to answer it, not knowing what to expect. "Hello?" he said, his voice breaking the silence of the room. But there was no response. The phone was still connected, but on the other end, there was nothing but a muffled, irregular sound. Carlos frowned even more, listening to the distant noise. It was slow, difficult breathing, as if someone was trying to speak but didn't have the strength. Something was very close to the microphone, but whoever it was seemed unable to communicate, to utter a word. Charles felt his spine freeze. The sound was disconcerting, as if he were listening to someone in pain, someone who needed help but couldn't ask for it. He looked at the phone with a mixture of confusion and fear. It was impossible for anyone to be there. Room 908 was empty, and no one else was on that floor. So why did this connection happen? Why did the ragged, muffled breathing sound so clearly? He hung up the phone quickly, the feeling of discomfort spreading throughout his body. Maybe it was just a joke, a prank. Some problem with the line, he thought. But despite trying to convince himself of this, a feeling of uneasiness came over him, something he couldn't ignore. He tried to push the thought away, trying to do what he did best, get on with his routine and finish his shift. The clock on the wall made a soft chime as the minutes ticked by. Everything seemed to be returning to normal. However, the next night, at exactly 3:03 in the morning, the phone rang again. The display unmistakably displayed room 908. Carlos felt a shiver, and although he had the feeling he should ignore it, his fingers were automatically moving to answer the phone, as if something was calling him to do so. When he picked up the receiver, the same muffled breathing sounded, on the other end, slowly, difficultly, as before. The feeling that something was wrong increased. He didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how to react to a call that seemed to come from a place where no one should be. Breathing was the only thing that filled the silence of the night. Carlos swallowed hard and hung up the phone again, feeling the tension build in his body. He glanced at the display once more. The screen still lit up with room number 908. Something compelled him to ignore, to give up on this strange sequence of events. But something inside him also made him wonder what was happening. How was this possible? That night, he decided not to let curiosity get the better of him, but the next morning, and the nights that followed, history repeated itself. At exactly 3 in the morning, the reception telephone rang again, always displaying the same number, always coming from the same unoccupied room. A tired breath, speechless, but full of a strange urgency. Each night seemed more unbearable, more unsettling than the last. What he was hearing didn't make sense. He tried to rationalize the situation, but the feeling that something was wrong, something he didn't understand, was growing inside him. He was in a rut he could no longer control. The phone called him every night, and with each call he found himself more caught up in something that seemed more and more real and more desperate. And while he was wondering what to do, the phone continued to ring, always at 3:03, like a warning he didn't know how to avoid. Carlos could no longer ignore it. The last few nights had dragged on like a repeated nightmare. At 3:03 in the morning, the landline at reception rang, always the same number, always the same empty room. The ragged breathing on the other end of the line no longer made sense. He knew something was wrong. He could no longer fool himself with simple explanations such as faulty lines or some kind of hoax. The feeling of being watched, of something calling him, grew every night. He could no longer let fear dictate his actions. On the 6th night, Carlos decided he would take action. He mentally noted the time, as he always did, and before the phone rang, he grabbed his flashlight and the keys to the equipment room. He was determined. Something compelled him to know what was happening in that damned room 908. His steps were steady, but each movement seemed to echo in his ears, the weight of the decision becoming more intense as he climbed. The floors. The elevator, as always, made a metallic sound when the doors closed. But that night, the sound seemed different. The elevator rose more slowly than usual, as if it were going to a place that resisted being reached. The building seemed to be even quieter than on other nights, as if the structure itself was suspended in a state of expectation, awaiting something that Carlos could not understand. When the elevator finally reached the 9th floor, Carlos felt a chill run down his spine. The floor was dark, the lights were off as always. The absence of any movement, the deep emptiness of that area, seemed to create a feeling of oppression, as if the building itself was breathing along with him. Carlos felt the air become denser and heavier as he entered the 9th floor corridor. The cold, which before was almost imperceptible, now became more acute, as if he was entering a place he shouldn't be accessing. Upon arriving in front of room 98, he stopped for a moment, looking at the door. It was as if she was challenging him, as if he was going to invade something he wasn't prepared to understand. The door was closed, locked as always, with no signs of life on the other side. There were no lights on, and the room seemed, from a distance, completely inert. But something inside Carlos pushed him to get even closer. He could no longer go back. He crouched down, putting his ear close to the door, listening for any sounds coming from inside. But the silence was absolute. He heard nothing except his own heart pounding in his chest, nerves tense and breathing heavier. Every second felt like an eternity, the tension increasing with each instant. He raised his head, still not daring to touch the handle, still not daring to open the door. And it was at that moment, when the anticipation became unbearable, that he heard the sound. The phone inside rang. The sound was clear and distinct, cutting through the silence in the room. Carlos felt his stomach turn, and his body seemed to contract in an involuntary reflex. The phone was ringing just like it did every night. But this time it was different. He was inside room 908, and the sound, now, seemed even more ominous, closer. It was as if the phone was calling to him, as if he were part of some terrible game he couldn't control. Carlos glanced at the door, his fingers shaking as he held the flashlight. The fear, previously contained, was now completely open, and he knew there was no turning back. He was at the limit of what the human mind could handle. He was about to discover what was inside the room, what was waiting for him, but a part of his brain was still begging him to run away, to go back and forget it all. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the cold hand on the door handle. The phone rang again, and his breathing became heavier, each second more difficult to bear. He had no choice. He pressed the handle and the door opened with a low creak. What he would see inside, he did not yet know, but in that moment, he knew nothing would ever be the same. Carlos unlocked the door with shaking hands, the metallic sound of the key turning in the lock resonating in the dark hallway. The door opened with a low creak, and the smell of mold and old wood filled his nostrils. The air inside the room was thick, almost sticky, as if the room had been sealed a long time ago. Each breath felt more labored, as if the air there was too thick to be absorbed by the lungs. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to control the feeling of oppression that was beginning to take over his body. But when he opened his eyes again, what he saw in front of him only increased his uneasiness. The room was covered in dust. The floor, shelves, and even the windows were covered in a thick layer of dirt. The moonlight that came through a crack in the window illuminated parts of the room, creating a contrast between the darkness and the cold light of the night. Shadows danced on the walls, and the light revealed antique furniture covered in white cloth, yellowed with age. The room seemed to have been abandoned for decades, as if it had been forgotten by everyone, even time. But something in the scene caught his attention, something that seemed out of place among those shadows and silence. The telephone. An old, desk telephone with a cord and dials was located on a small wooden table near the wall. The device was illuminated by a single beam of moonlight, the cold glow reflecting off the device's dark surface. It was as if he had been waiting, as if the phone had been placed there in that exact place for Carlos to find it. The sight of the phone made Carlos's heart beat faster, the restlessness becoming almost unbearable. He approached slowly, each step heavy and hesitant. The sound of his feet on the wooden floor seemed deafening in the absolute silence. He didn't know what he was waiting for, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. The phone was ringing once again, and he couldn't help but answer it. When he reached the phone, the ringing sound echoed throughout the room, as if it were reverberating off the walls and Carlos's own body. The sound was normal, the sound of an old telephone ringing, but there was something wrong. It seemed louder than it should have been, like it was echoing inside him, like the sound was coming from his own chest. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers reaching towards the device, but the ringing sound became more and more unbearable, as if it were trapped inside his head. Carlos swallowed hard, his hand shaking as he reached for the phone. When his fingers touched the device, he lifted it with an automatic gesture, but his mind was still clouded with anxiety. The phone was heavy, heavier than he expected, and as he held it, a strange feeling formed in his stomach, as if the phone was absorbing his energy, as if it were sucking something out of him. He placed the phone against his ear. The sound of breathing, ragged and slow, immediately filled him. It was no longer a touch. It was a breath, almost human, but not quite. It was a muffled sound, as if the person on the other end was struggling to breathe, as if they were suffocating but were unable to utter words. The feeling of anguish increased in Carlos, and his mind became clouded with the idea that something was there, waiting, but without words to express themselves. The breathing, instead of moving away, seemed to intensify, becoming closer, more urgent. Carlos felt pressure in his head, as if the room itself was compressing around him, as if the walls were slowly closing in, trying to trap something there with him. The sound of breathing seemed to expand within him, as if the space was being filled by that invisible presence, as if he was no longer the only being there. He pulled the phone away from his ear, panic beginning to spread through his body. He wanted to hang up, but his hand was paralyzed, as if the phone was attached to him, as if it had become an extension of his own fear. But the sound of breathing continued, louder, more disturbing. Then, without further resistance, he hung up the phone with a sharp movement, but the echo of his breathing remained, reverberating within him. The silence in the room seemed to be present again, but not in a comforting way. It was a charged silence, as if the sound of breathing was still there, as if the presence he had felt was materializing. He looked at the phone, now silent, but the fear didn't lessen. Something, or someone was there, and Carlos knew it wouldn't be easy to escape from that room. He didn't know what was behind that breath, but now he was closer than ever to finding out. Carlos held the phone with shaking hands, the flashlight still in his other hand, illuminating the room unsteadily. The sound of breathing was still echoing on the other side, but now there was something more. It was no longer just slow, irregular breathing. He noticed a subtle movement in the breath, as if the person on the other end was preparing to speak, to express themselves. The sound of inhalations intensified, as if the being, the thing there, was trying hard to communicate. The air was charged, and fear began to take hold of Carlos in a way he had never experienced before. He held the phone to his ear, eyes fixed on the room, tension growing, as muffled breathing seemed to extend into the space around him. Every second seemed to drag by, and then finally the voice came. It wasn't a word. It was a question. "Why are you here?" Carlos was paralyzed. The voice was unmistakable. It was his own voice, but it wasn't exactly the same. There was something about the tonality, the way the sound was delivered, that seemed wrong. The voice came from far away, slurred and slow, as if it had been forced out of someone who was already too tired to speak. It was his voice, but distorted, hoarser, harder to understand. And despite it being his own voice, the question it carried felt like an accusation, something accusing him of something he didn't fully understand. "Why are you here?" The question dragged through the air, reverberating off the walls of the room, crashing against Carlos's chest like a wave that knocked him over. He felt a lump in his throat, the anguish increasing quickly. Something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just hazing. It wasn't just breathing. The voice had changed, but in a way he couldn't explain. He knew it didn't make sense. There was no one there, no one else in the room, just him, the phone, and that presence. He dropped the phone abruptly, as if it had been burned, as if the weight of it was unbearable. The device fell to the floor with a crunch, but the sound of breathing still seemed to echo through the room, filling the space with an invisible presence. Carlos backed away quickly, his breathing heavy and uncontrolled, his eyes wide as he took in the dark room around him. Each shadow seemed to be denser, closer. He could no longer distinguish where the room ended and where that immense fear that enveloped him began. He didn't know what was happening. I didn't know how that was possible. His voice, the same voice he heard every day, was now somewhere beyond his mind, beyond the phone. The feeling of being watched, took over his entire body. He turned to look at the door, thinking about getting out of there, about running away from that room. But, as if the space was somehow controlled by a greater force, he was unable to move. He looked at the phone lying on the floor, still not having the courage to approach it. The weight of the voice still hung over him, like a shadow that wouldn't let him breathe. The words, "Why are you here?" echoed in his mind, as if he were being interrogated, as if he were a stranger in this place. He knew he was no longer the same person who had entered the room a few minutes earlier. Something had changed, something he couldn't explain, but it was slowly consuming him. The silence in the room now seemed amplified. Every crack of the old wood, every noise coming from outside was louder, more intense. He didn't know what to do, where to go. The feeling of being trapped intensified with every second. He wished he had an explanation, something to ease his mind. But the only thing he knew now was that he was no longer alone there. Something, or someone, was watching him, waiting for him to do something, anything, to complete whatever this experience was. Carlos looked around once more, eyes fixed on the shadows, waiting for something to move, waiting for the presence to reveal itself. But all he felt was the weight of that question, that voice that accused him, that challenged him. "Why are you here?" Fear paralyzed him, and he knew in that moment that he could never again ignore what was happening in that building. Room 908 was now a prison, and he didn't know if he could escape. Carlos stood still in the middle of the room, still feeling like his mind was trying to understand what had just happened. He was sure that the voice he heard was not a trick, was not a hallucination. It was his own voice, but distorted, strange, as if he was no longer in control of his words. He looked at the phone lying on the floor, his hand still shaking, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of breathing, previously muffled, now seemed to be filling the entire space, but it was no longer the only thing he heard. The phone, which he had disconnected, started ringing again. The sound was unbearable. Even with the cord disconnected, from the base the phone continued to ring, as if something was forcing the device to work, as if an invisible force was determined to maintain the cycle. Carlos looked at the device, not knowing what to do, not understanding how that was possible. He was out of control. Fear spread through his body like a poison, but at the same time, he was paralyzed, trapped in this room that seemed to be becoming increasingly strange. He approached the door in an attempt to leave, but as he tried to turn the handle, he noticed something even more disturbing. The door was locked from the inside. There was no visible lock, but the feeling that something was preventing him from leaving was unmistakable. He turned the handle several times, trying to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. He pressed his palms against the wooden surface, trying to push it away, but the blockage seemed to be coming from within, as if someone, or something, had locked the door invisibly from within the room itself. Panic began to take over him. The room was colder, and the feeling that something wasn't right intensified. He looked around, trying to find some logical explanation for what was happening. The air seemed denser, heavier, and the temperature dropped frighteningly. The cloths on the dust-covered furniture he had noticed earlier began to move. The edges of the white towels, with a subtle movement, swayed as if an invisible breeze was passing through them. But the windows were closed. There was no wind there, and the room seemed to be completely sealed. Carlos took a step back, his eyes fixed on the slowly moving cloths. Fear was now completely upon him, dominating his senses. He forced himself to look around, searching for some way out, something that would free him from that growing feeling of despair. That was when his eyes fell on the corner of the room, where a mirror was positioned. He hadn't noticed the mirror before, but now it was there, reflecting the room, the scene in front of him. And that's when the shock hit him with full force. In the mirror, he saw his reflection. But something was terribly wrong. His reflection was completely still. His own movements were not being reflected. He wasn't moving, although he was clearly in motion, backing away from the door, taking in his surroundings. His reflection, however, was still, static, with his eyes fixed on an invisible point in front of him. The feeling of being out of control, of something completely out of place, took over him with the same intensity as a nightmare becoming real. The mirror reflected a version of himself that was outside of his reality, a copy that was not connected to him, as if it were an independent entity, a separate being, standing still while the real Carlos moved. The fear increased. He shook his head, trying to force his vision to change, but the reflection in the mirror wouldn't move. He raised his hand, and the reflection remained still. He took a step back, and the image was still fixed, as if it was waiting for something he didn't understand. The sound of the phone continued, now louder, more urgent, like an unbearable call. What should he do? How to get out of that room? How can I escape that feeling of being trapped, of being completely at the mercy of something I couldn't understand? Carlos no longer knew what was real. He looked back at the locked door, and then at the mirror, trying desperately to find some explanation, some logic that would make him understand what was happening. But the answers didn't come. Fear enveloped him more, and with every second he felt more distant from himself. He didn't know how much longer he could stand being there in that place where nothing made sense, where even his reflection seemed to mock him. He needed to leave. I needed to understand what was happening. But try as he might, he didn't know how. Carlos could no longer take his eyes off the mirror. Something was happening there. Something he couldn't understand, but that his mind could no longer ignore. The reflection, which had previously been motionless, now seemed to have taken on a life of its own. He approached slowly, fear heavy in each step, feeling the air around him weigh even more, as if space was closing in on him. The reflection was still, but when he got close enough, something terrible happened. The reflection smiled, but it wasn't a natural smile, something a human being would do easily. It was a strange, distant, almost mechanical smile. The reflection's lips were still, but the expression on the face seemed unbearably forced, as if the figure was trying to display something that shouldn't be there. The smile didn't seem to reflect any true emotion, and instead of calming him, it only increased the dread that already dominated him. Carlos walked away a little, his eyes fixed on the image, trying to process what was happening. It was then that the voice, which he already knew from the calls, returned. But this time it wasn't coming from the phone. The voice seemed to emerge from the mirror itself, from the figure in front of him. It was the same ragged breathing he had heard before, but now clearer, more real. The voice, deeper and filled with an unsettling tension, sounded again. You always climb, and you always forget. The words reverberated in the room, and Carlos felt paralyzed. The feeling that he had already lived this moment before took over him, as if everything was part of a cycle from which he could not escape. The voice seemed to know him, knowing every step he would take, every action, as if he were just a spectator of his own life. But the worst was yet to come. The reflection in the mirror moved. It wasn't a normal movement, something natural. The figure, still with that strange smile, tilted its head to the side, as if it were studying Carlos, observing him with morbid curiosity. It was as if the figure was reveling in the terror he felt, as if it was taking control of his mind. He tried to move away, to take a step back, but his feet were stuck to the floor. Fear paralyzed him, and the more he tried to escape that feeling, the stronger it became. Carlos tried to scream, but his voice broke. Nothing came out of his throat, just a faint sound, as if his voice had been ripped from his body. He felt his mouth move, his lungs trying to release the scream, but nothing happened. He was completely mute, unable to express himself, to react. The feeling of helplessness took over him, and he looked desperately at his reflection, trying to find some sign that this wasn't real, that everything was just an illusion created by his tired mind. But the reflection was still there, unchanged, with that sinister smile that didn't seem natural. That's when suddenly, the mirror went dark. It wasn't a simple loss of light. It wasn't a momentary failure. The surface of the glass was swallowed by dense darkness, as if the reflection was being consumed by an endless shadow. Darkness spread throughout the room, making the environment even more oppressive, harder to breathe. Carlos tried to move away, tried to run away from that place, but the shadows were everywhere. The room was being swallowed by darkness, and he didn't know where to go. The only sound that remained was breathing. The same breathing he had heard on the calls, the same breathing that now filled the space around him. It was stronger, closer, as if it were coming from inside the mirror itself, from inside his mind. The muffled sound of breathing seemed to become more intense, more desperate, until he could no longer discern where the sound ended and where the silence began. The space was completely empty, but the presence, The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Carlos sat on the floor, his mind aware that there was no longer any escape. He had gone up, he had ignored the signs, and now there was no turning back. He would always forget and always come back to the same spot. The question echoing in his mind was clear. Why was he there? And at the same time, he knew the answer, because he couldn't get out of that cycle. He would always come back, and the reflection would always watch him, waiting. And in the absolute silence of the room, the breath remained, still present, still there, as if it were the only real thing, at that moment, the only thing left. Carlos was immersed in the absolute silence of the room, the weight of the darkness becoming unbearable. He had experienced something he could no longer understand, something that surpassed the limits of what reason could process. The reflection, the figure watching him, the distorted smile and the strange voice. Everything seemed like a mess in his mind. He wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but the space around him was tight. Every shadow seemed to envelop him more. He felt the breath of what was watching him intensify, filling the air with a suffocating presence. But downstairs everything was calm. The clock on the reception wall said 3 and 4 in the morning. The building, as always, was enveloped in silence. The security team that was supposed to be watching the cameras was not there, and the surveillance room was empty. The only thing visible on the screen was the image of the entrance, showing Carlos, sitting in his chair, motionless, as if he were paralyzed by what had just happened. He stared at the phone, as if he was waiting for something, waiting for reality, to return to normal. But he didn't move. He was stuck somewhere, in some state between the physical world and what was happening to him. The image from the security camera at the entrance seemed frozen in time, but something was wrong. In the recording, behind Carlos, there was a second figure. The outline was indistinct, a shadow that seemed darker than its surroundings, as if something was projected into the darkness, a presence that shouldn't be there. The figure stood still, motionless, as if it were part of the distorted reflection that Carlos had seen earlier. But now it was behind him, watching him the same way the reflection had watched him before. The figure didn't move, but the feeling that it was there, just waiting, made the environment seem even more oppressive. The camera blinked, and the image was interrupted for a moment. The monitor went blank, and the sound from the camera system cut out, creating an even more intense feeling of emptiness. When the camera started working again, the figure behind Carlos had disappeared. There was no longer any shadow, no presence in that room. Carlos was alone, or so it seemed. But, upon observing more closely, a strange sensation settled in the minds of those watching. The image only showed one janitor in the chair, but which one? Time seemed to stop. The image on the screen fixed on Carlos, now motionless, still staring at the phone, but the feeling of discomfort that spread through the air was undeniable. The figure, which had previously been behind him, was now gone, but something about Carlos's posture, the way he was sitting, suggested he wasn't alone. The image appeared to be distorted, as if the presence visible in the video was no longer the same. The caretaker seemed to have been replaced by something that could not be explained. The doubt persisted, and the recording that should have been a simple documentation of a normal work shift became an even greater enigma. The camera flashed again, and now, besides Carlos, there was an undefined presence. What was happening in the lobby, on the lower floor? Who was in that room, really? It was as if the janitor was merging with something that didn't belong to him, a duplicity that couldn't be ignored. The reflection in the mirror, the shadow behind him, and now this figure in the camera. He was no longer just a victim of his own perception. He was part of something bigger, something he could no longer control, something that shouldn't exist. The clock in the lobby, which previously showed 3 and 4 minutes in the morning, now seemed to drag. Time was at odds with reality, and Carlos no longer knew where the world he knew ended and where the nightmare he couldn't escape began. The figure that watched him was not a reflection. He was there, and somehow, he always had been. The following night, The building was once again immersed in its usual silence. Darkness took over the empty hallways, with the only sound coming from the fluorescent lights flickering faintly on the ceilings. The new shift replacement, a young man named Lucas, had arrived to cover the early morning hours, still adapting to solitary work. It was his first night, and he didn't know much about the routine there, except for the warnings they had given him. But there was one warning in particular that I couldn't get out of my head. "If the phone in room 908 rings, don't answer it," the supervisor said before leaving. "It's just an old story going around here. A beginner's joke. Just ignore it and move on." Lucas laughed, thinking it was another one of those stories that spread among newbies to scare them. He was young and confident, and the idea of being scared off by a simple phone call seemed ridiculous. After all, he knew he was dealing with a simple routine matter. The building had a long and ancient history, and he knew that people loved to create urban legends to make work more interesting. So he ignored the supervisor's words and prepared for his first night alone. The night seemed peaceful at first. Lucas did his routine, walking through the floors, turning off the lights and locking the doors as always. The clock in the lobby showed 3 hours and 2 minutes in the morning when he passed by reception, watching the security camera monitors. The building was calm, empty, with no signs of life. But, as always, something was about to break the silence. At 3:03 in the morning, the phone at the reception rang. Lucas froze for a moment, looking at the viewfinder. The call number indicated room 908. The supervisor's warning came to his mind, but he quickly laughed at himself. He was alone, and he wasn't going to let a simple story stop his work. The phone rang insistently, as if it were calling him. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, more insistent, as if he had to answer. With a sigh and a slight nervous smile, Lucas answered the phone. "Hello?" His voice sounded strange in the silence, as if he was waiting for a response. At first, there was no response, just the sound of slow, ragged breathing. It was a muffled sound, difficult to distinguish, as if something, or someone, was trying to control itself, trying not to make itself heard. But the breath was there, filling the space in a disconcerting way, as if it were getting closer, as if it were coming from very close. Lucas hesitated for a moment, a growing discomfort washing over him. He almost hung up the phone, but something stopped him. The breathing increased in intensity, and then a voice was heard. It was a familiar voice, a voice he recognized as his own. "Now you understand." The voice sounded cold, distant, and something about it made Lucas's blood run cold. It was as if the person on the other side already knew everything about him, as if they were simply enjoying the terror that was beginning to spread inside him. The voice wasn't his. It was no longer the voice of whoever was listening, but something much deeper, much more threatening. The feeling of being watched, of being a part of something that could no longer be controlled, enveloped Lucas like an immense wave. He tried to speak, tried to ask what was happening, but his throat felt dry, his body paralyzed. The voice, so similar to his own, echoed in his mind, and he began to feel the same sensation that the janitor, the former employee, had felt. The fear he had dismissed as mere legend now became a terrifying reality. The breathing was still there, and the voice repeated in his mind, "Now you understand." Lucas felt his heart beat faster, his hand sweating as he held the phone. He wanted to hang up, but his hand felt like it was made of stone. The idea of escaping that moment seemed impossible. Fear dominated him, and he didn't know what to do. He didn't know where to go. Whatever it was there with him, and he was trapped, completely vulnerable. And then, the phone turned off. The silence in the room was oppressive. The sound of the phone hanging up was like the end of a curtain, closing the only way out of a nightmare he could barely understand. He looked at the phone for a few seconds, his mind trying to process what had just happened, but nothing made sense. He didn't know what that meant, nor what he had heard, but one thing was clear. He was no longer alone in the building. And more than that, he knew the cycle had begun again. The night was quiet in the hospital. The silence was heavy. interrupted only by the faint beeping of heart monitors that echoed in the distance, as if they were the only signs of life in a building that seemed to fall asleep with the arrival of night. Each hallway was poorly lit, with fluorescent lights that failed to completely dispel shadows, creating a cold and distorted environment where time seemed to drag on unbearably. Nurse Mariana entered the reception, her footsteps echoing on the cold tile floor. She straightened her uniform and prepared for the night shift, the shift in which the hospital was emptier, quieter, and where tensions increased as the hours passed. The reception was deserted, as always at that time. No visitors, no patients, just the sound of the air conditioning humming softly and the cool LED light reflecting off the white tiles. Mariana approached the table, straightened out some papers and prepared for the first records of the shift. But something caught his attention. The large round clock hung above the reception desk, a classic antique model whose hands seemed to be moving strangely. She blinked, doubting what she saw, but when she looked again, she was sure. The hands were going backwards, as if time was unraveling, as if the clock was defying logic. Mariana looked at her watch more closely, trying to understand what was happening. She thought maybe it was tiredness, maybe it was the reflection of the lights on the glass, but no, the hands were still moving backwards. With every second, time seemed to distort, as if something had altered the timeline of that place. She blinked again, trying to shake off the strange feeling. But when she looked back, the hands had moved even further back, advancing to previous hours, defying everything she knew about time. What she was seeing couldn't be real. She approached the clock, touching the cold surface of the glass, and yet the hands continued to turn erratically. A feeling of discomfort took over her body, but she tried to push the thought away. It's just a defect, she thought, trying to convince herself. But even when she looked once more, the clock continued to tick backwards, as if it were rewinding existence itself. Mariana walked away, her stomach churning with the feeling of strangeness. She took a deep breath and focused on the tasks in front of her, trying to ignore the clock that somehow didn't seem to belong in the hospital, as if it were an anomaly, something that shouldn't be there. She knew she was just starting her shift, but she already felt like time was becoming a prison, like she was being watched by something she couldn't understand. She sat down at the table and began reviewing the patient's medical records. The first times and entries were up to date, but something in those records caught his attention. Some of them felt wrong. She noticed that some hospitalizations had not yet occurred, but were recorded, as if they were predictions, as if the future had been documented in advance. Mariana was silent for a moment, the paper in front of her now smudged by the moisture from her hands. She looked at the clock again, still in reverse, and felt a shiver run down her spine. Something was wrong. Something much deeper than she imagined was unfolding, but she couldn't understand what. Before I could process anything, the reception phone rang. Mariana was startled, and for a moment, she felt the weight of all that silence intensifying. She answered, the phone cold in her hand, but no one answered. Just the sound of breathing, slow and uneven, on the other end of the line. She flinched, not knowing what to think. When he tried to speak, the line went dead. She hung up quickly, fear rising within her. But as she tried to calm down, the medical records she had reviewed began to float through her mind. That feeling that time was failing, that something was unfolding in a distorted way, intensified, and the certainty that she was no longer in control of the shift engulfed her. The clock kept ticking backwards, and Mariana, now aware that something far beyond her understanding was happening, didn't know if she could escape the coming cycle. She looked at the records and knew without a doubt that her shift was about to take an irreversible turn. Mariana couldn't take her mind off the clock. She knew something was wrong, but her mind tried to justify it, trying to find a rational explanation. When the hands first started moving backwards, she had thought it was a simple defect. Perhaps something in the clock mechanism was worn out, perhaps a glitch. But looking at the display once again, she realized that the problem wasn't just restricted to the reception clock. The building was silent and immense, and time seemed to be becoming a living presence, a force she couldn't control. She did what anyone would do in a situation like this. She called the maintenance technician. He arrived quickly, a man with a calm appearance, used to dealing with unexpected situations in the hospital. But when he looked at the clock at reception, he frowned. "It must be a mechanical defect," he said with the confidence of someone who had repaired countless watches. He moved the gears of the device, tried to adjust the hands, but as soon as he walked away, the hands started to rotate backwards once again, without any plausible explanation. The technician spent a few minutes inspecting the watch, trying to find a visible flaw, but found nothing. "Strange," he said. "No other clock in the hospital is having this problem. Only this one." Mariana watched in silence, trying to remain calm, but something inside her knew that the clock wasn't the only problem. What else was there? Why was that specific clock so out of place? When the technician walked away and said there was nothing he could do for now, she was left alone at the front desk, the clock still ticking backwards, challenging her perception of time. The feeling of discomfort was growing, becoming unbearable. She glanced at the clock once more, but her eyes were soon drawn to the reception computer monitors, which displayed patient entries. As I typed on the computer to update the records, something even stranger happened. Some of the patient records she had seen previously didn't make sense. These were not current entries, but rather records of hospitalizations that had not yet occurred, as if they were being filled in the future. She leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the screen. Admissions were dated hours into the future, and, even more disturbing, the patients who had been listed were not even in the hospital yet. She clicked on one of the most recent records and saw something even more horrific. A familiar name, her own name, listed as an inpatient, with the cause of death described in detail. Cardiac arrest at 4:17 in the morning. Mariana swallowed. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her own name, her own death, recorded so precisely, as if it were something that had already happened, something she couldn't escape. A feeling of dread took over his body. She looked at the clock again, now the hands moving even faster backwards, time becoming more and more blurred. Mariana's rapid breathing seemed to be the only sound in the room, muffled by the feeling of claustrophobia that surrounded her. She knew she couldn't continue ignoring what was happening, but at the same time, she didn't know how to react. The computer seemed to be moving at another pace, another time, as if the hospital itself was in a state of distortion, where the future and the past were blurring together. Mariana's hands shook as she tried unsuccessfully to access the records again. The name was still there, registered, inescapable. She rose from her chair, trying to ignore the growing feeling that time was disintegrating around her. The clock continued to tick backwards, every second further away from the reality she knew. She picked up the phone, determined to call someone, to explain what was going on, but the cord seemed to have gotten tangled in a strange way. The clock in her vision seemed to speed up, the hands spinning backwards faster and faster, and she knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that something was about to happen. Something she couldn't stop. Time had become her enemy, and there was no turning back. The feeling that her destiny was already set, that the death that was recorded in those papers was inevitable, consumed her. The watch was not a defect. It was a warning, and time was no longer on her side. Mariana sat at the reception desk, her fingers typing automatically as she reviewed the medical records. The room was silent, the clock on the wall still showing the same time as before, but the discomfort in his chest only grew. Something wasn't right. The clock seemed to speed up the minutes, and the environment seemed colder, more distant. She looked once again at the large round clock hanging on the wall, but nothing changed. What she really needed to do was focus on her work, follow the routine and ignore what she couldn't understand. But then, as he looked at his computer monitor, something caught his eye. She had finished updating the patient records when, suddenly, a new file appeared on the screen, with the admission date set for the next few hours. She clicked on the card, not thinking much about what she was doing, but what she saw made her stop immediately. The patient's name was there, complete with all the data. But what was most disturbing was the description of what he was feeling. A middle-aged man, with symptoms of chest pain, sweating, breathing difficulties. She read the form more carefully. The description of the diagnosis was also there, with frightening precision, acute myocardial infarction. Everything seemed to be there, perfectly detailed, as if it were a description of something that had already happened. Unease began to grow in her stomach, like a feeling that she was being pulled to a place she didn't understand. Mariana didn't know what to think, but when she looked at the date on the form, she felt a chill. The time was set for exactly 2 hours later. With a growing sense of strangeness, she turned away from the table and tried to focus on other tasks. But he couldn't. The image of the medical record, with all the details, was recorded in his mind. Something was wrong with the weather in that place. What was happening? How were those records there, so detailed, with everything she had just seen? Was it a prediction or a mistake? Mariana tried to ignore it, but the discomfort intensified. She felt the cold increase, not just physical, but an internal sense of something watching her, something she couldn't control. She was silent for a moment, trying to collect her thoughts, but deep down, she already knew what was about to happen. 2 hours later, as if it were confirmation of what she already feared, a man walked through the hospital's main door. He was having trouble breathing, his forehead was sweaty, and he was leaning on someone's arm as he tried to walk. The scene was exact, as if it had been taken directly from the medical chart she had seen. Mariana felt a wave of dread pass through her. Adi. She recognized him immediately. It was the same man described in the file, the same name, the same condition. Time seemed to slow down as she watched his entrance, feeling each second pass more slowly. What was happening? How was this possible? How was a medical record that should not yet have been written accurately describing an event that was now unfolding right before his eyes? The man was led to the reception, and as he approached, Mariana could barely breathe. She tried not to look at him, but she knew that something much bigger than simple coincidences was happening there. She looked back at the computer screen, where the system was still showing the man's file. He was there, exactly as predicted. The room seemed to grow colder, heavier. Mariana looked at the clock on the wall again. Time was no longer moving the same way. She could no longer trust what she saw. It was as if the line between what had already happened and what was yet to come was completely blurred. The reception clock, still with its hands turning strangely, seemed to be the only thing that confirmed his suspicions. Something was distorting reality in that hospital, and Mariana found herself lost, not knowing how to escape something she couldn't control. She didn't know what else the hospital could hide, but the feeling that she was trapped in a cycle where time and reality were unraveling grew with every second. The man was taken to the emergency room, and Mariana knew that what was happening was no coincidence. Something much bigger was at stake, something she perhaps couldn't avoid. Mariana could no longer concentrate on her work. The clock at the reception, that same old clock that had always hung there, was becoming more and more of an obsession. She knew time was behaving strangely, but with every glance, with every attempt to ignore it, it seemed to distort even more. Whenever she looked directly at it, the hands turned backwards, moving towards the past hours. She blinked, confused, but when she looked away, the hands started moving again as they should, indicating the correct time, as if nothing had happened. It was as if the clock was playing with her, challenging her perception of reality, but only when she was looking directly at it. The feeling of being tested, of being trapped in a game she didn't understand, made her stomach turn. It was as if time was mocking her, challenging her ability to maintain her sanity. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to shake off the fear that was taking over her body. But when she opened her eyes again, the clock was even more out of control, the hands spinning backwards more quickly, as if they were racing towards a time that could not be reached. Mariana knew something was deeply wrong. She began to walk away, trying to focus on her other tasks, trying to forget the strange time distortion that was happening around her, but she couldn't ignore the fact that the watch didn't behave naturally, and every time she looked at it, her mind seemed to get a little more lost in the chaos that surrounded it. With a sigh, she approached the heart rate machine that sat next to the reception desk. She checked patients' readings, a routine she was already familiar with, but when she looked at the machine's digital display, her heart nearly stopped. The numbers that appeared on the screen were distorted impossibly. Negative times, numbers in fractions of a second, as if time was being measured in a way that made no sense. The heartbeat of a patient she was monitoring was showing values that were beyond explanation. Each number seemed distorted, as if the flow of time was completely reversed. Mariana tried to concentrate, her mind panicking as the numbers continued to flow, each one more absurd than the last. She looked away, trying to understand what was happening, but the feeling that the clock was controlling everything, that time no longer worked as it should, only intensified. It was then that, on impulse, she approached the clock on the wall. Something inside her compelled her to touch him, as if she wanted to feel reality adjusting in some way, as if she were trying to re-establish some control over the distortion that surrounded her. When her fingers touched the cold surface of the glass, something chilled her to the bone. She felt a pulse, a heartbeat coming from inside the watch, as if the watch itself had life, as if it were pulsing along with the time it was trying to control. The feeling of panic intensified, but at the same time, a part of Mariana wanted to understand what was happening, wanted to discover the truth behind this impossible phenomenon. She tapped the clock again, louder this time, trying to feel the beat more clearly. The sound of the pulse seemed to come from within the mechanism, as if the clock were an extension of a body that was somewhere, waiting to reveal itself. The feeling was surreal. The clock, which should have been a simple timekeeper, now seemed to carry within it a dark secret, something that shouldn't exist. Mariana felt her mind slowly unraveling, reality becoming increasingly opaque. Time, as she knew it, no longer seemed real. He was distorting himself before her, making her doubt everything. The clock was alive, and it was controlling time in ways she couldn't understand. The heartbeat coming from inside the watch continued, and Mariana knew that somehow she was connected to it. Something was happening to her, something she could no longer control. She took her hand away from the clock, feeling fear spread through her body, but the sound of the pulse continued to echo in her mind, mixed with the sound of the hands that were still spinning backwards, faster and faster. She didn't know how to get out of that feeling of confusion, of distortion. The clock was more than just an object. It was a door to something she didn't understand. She felt the weight of it, and as she watched the hands turn, a part of her being knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Time had broken in that hospital, and now she was a part of it, not knowing if she could escape. Mariana couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The clock at reception kept spinning backwards, as if mocking his perception of time, and the heart rate machine was still showing numbers that shouldn't be there. She could feel the tension building inside her, like a wave sweeping her away. But instead of moving away from the system, something pushed her to continue investigating. She needed to understand what was happening. She needed to find some explanation for the medical records that seemed to be coming from a parallel reality, where the future and the past were confused in a terrifying way. On the second night, Mariana sat at the reception desk, determined to continue her search. The sound of the heart monitors and the clock continued to fill her with discomfort, but she forced herself to focus on the computer screen, hoping that, somehow, she would find some logical explanation for it. She logged into the system again, checking patient records. With each new access, a new form appeared, each one more precise, more detailed, as if the system was filling in the gaps of the future. She tried to ignore the growing panic that was beginning to take over her. But with each new record, something more sinister emerged. Each file seemed to describe patients who had not yet been admitted, but the information was there, dated, with symptoms described with disconcerting precision. She clicked on one of the most recent records, and when she opened the file, a feeling of terror took over her body. There was a familiar name there, the name of a man she recognized. He was around 40 years old, and the chart described symptoms of chest pain, cold sweats, and breathing difficulties. She read the form more carefully, feeling fear rising within her. The diagnosis was clear: acute myocardial infarction. She looked at the admission date and froze. It was scheduled for exactly 2 hours later. The file was there, completely detailed with everything she needed to know, as if the future had already been written. A feeling of dread took over Mariana. How was this possible? How did the system know exactly what was going to happen? How could there be such a precise description for something that hadn't even happened yet? Discomfort washed over her like a wave. She tried to turn away from the screen, trying to focus on other things, but the vision of the medical record wouldn't leave her mind. What was happening? How could something like that register as something that was yet to come, something she hadn't seen and yet was there waiting to happen? The form was dated with the time of admission, and the system was not just predicting it. He was, in some way, getting the future documented. She looked at the clock at the front desk. The hands, as always, seemed to be spinning backwards, and now the feeling that she was trapped in an endless cycle only increased. What was happening in that place? How did time seem to no longer behave the way it should? She no longer knew if she was losing control or if she was seeing something she should never have seen. 2 hours later, as if the prediction was being fulfilled before his eyes, the man entered the main door of the hospital. He was having trouble breathing, his forehead was sweaty, and he was leaning on someone's arm as he tried to walk. He entered, exactly as the form predicted. Mariana felt a cold take over her body. It was the same man, with the same symptoms described in the file. He was led to the reception, and with every step he took, Mariana felt that the reality around her was disintegrating. She knew that what she was seeing was not a simple coincidence. It was a confirmation. She turned away from the computer and tried to focus on patient care, but a growing sense of dread wouldn't leave her. What else could the hospital hide? How was something so extraordinary happening, like a prediction of something that hadn't happened yet? And what else could come next? She knew that time was breaking and there was no turning back. Mariana felt her heart beat faster as the man was taken to emergency care. The watch, heart rate machine, and system seemed to run at a speed she could no longer control. Everything was colliding, and time was about to collide with her. The fear did not leave her. The record was just the beginning. What else did the future hold for him? Mariana tried to ignore the feeling of panic that was growing inside her, but she couldn't anymore. The medical record she had seen with her own name was still burned into her mind, with grisly details about her imminent death. She knew that what was happening at the hospital had no logical explanation. Time was becoming increasingly unstable, the clock ticking backwards every time she looked, and the medical records continued to change in disconcerting ways. Desperate, she went to the infirmary, looking for one of her colleagues to try to understand what was happening. She approached Laura, an experienced nurse, hoping that she too was realizing the strangeness of the events. Mariana explained what was happening: the watch, the medical records with predictions, and her own medical record that seemed to have been written in advance. Laura looked at her with a skeptical expression and shook her head. "I don't know what you're imagining, Mariana, but this all seems to be a mistake. There is no record with your name in the system," said Laura, trying to calm her down. But Mariana felt a chill when she heard this. She knew what she had seen, but her colleagues seemed completely oblivious to what was happening. Unable to convince Laura and other colleagues, Mariana decided to speak to a doctor, Dr. Roberto, a calm and methodical man. He offered to check the system for her, trying to help her in a more professional way. After some time, he printed out the next day's medical records, and when he handed them to her, Mariana was horrified to see that the pages were completely empty. "That doesn't make sense," said Dr. Roberto, looking at the blank papers. "The system generated the records, but there is no data. It could be a computer error, some kind of technical failure." Mariana felt the pressure in her chest increase. It couldn't be a system error. The predictions were there, clear, recorded with precision. Her name, the cause of death, the exact time. Everything was happening in a way that couldn't be explained. But she tried to convince herself that maybe it was a technological failure, a rational explanation that could justify it all. She took a deep breath and decided to leave for a moment, to try and calm down. "I'll leave the records here. I'll get some rest. This will pass," she thought, trying to shake off the fear that consumed her. However, when she returned to the room, things were even scarier. The medical record that had disappeared was back, now with more details. His name was there, with an additional note. Mariana looked at the computer screen and read the new description. Patient tries to escape his destiny. Without success. Exacti. Time of collapse. When he looks at the clock at 4 hours and 17 minutes. Mariana froze. The file was even more detailed, now with a description that seemed more like a condemnation than a simple medical note. It was as if the system was anticipating its future, as if time was unfolding in a predestined and immutable way. Terror took over her in an overwhelming way. She was no longer dealing with a simple system failure or technological anomaly. She was dealing with something much bigger, something much more sinister. She looked at the clock on the reception wall, and as the hands slowly moved, the feeling that destiny was fulfilling itself every second paralyzed her. The clock was approaching 4:17 in the morning. Time was becoming his enemy. What would happen when the clock strikes that time? Mariana could no longer rationalize what was happening, but she knew that the fate the system seemed to predict was closer than ever. Desperate, she looked for a way out, an explanation, but the clock in the system gave no respite. Fear took over her, and with each look at the clock, the certainty that the final hour was approaching increased. She knew that somehow, what was happening at the hospital couldn't be avoided. Time was unfolding relentlessly, and she was just watching her own collapse, which seemed to have been predicted from the beginning. Mariana was paralyzed by anxiety, her heartbeat echoing in her ears like a drum, faster and stronger with each passing second. The reception clock stood before her, its relentless hands advancing towards the destination she now feared with all her might. The clock said 3 hours and 30 minutes, but something was happening to her. She felt her heart racing, the palpitations overwhelming her. She glanced at the clock once more, and panic took over her, like a wave crashing through her mind. She tried to take a deep breath, trying to shake off the fear, but she couldn't. The feeling that something was about to happen became stronger, more palpable. With each breath, the pressure in his chest increased. She knew she was close to something she couldn't understand, something that was beyond her control. With her heart beating wildly, she stood up from the reception chair, trying to get away from the clock, the system, everything that was consuming her. He splashed his face with cold water from the nearby bathroom sink, trying to regain control. She needed to stop, think, understand what was happening. But even with his face wet, the feeling of suffocation did not disappear. She looked into the mirror, her reflection, and wondered if what she was seeing was still real. But he didn't have time to think about that now. She needed to get out, needed to run away from that feeling of inevitability. Something was happening with time, and she could no longer trust the timeline she knew. The clock was not just an object, it was becoming a prison. Mariana ran through the hospital corridors, trying to escape what was haunting her, but at every turn, at every door she opened, she found herself back in the same spot. The corridor stretched out in front of her, but every exit seemed to close. Every door that opened took her back to reception. The hospital lights began to flicker, shaking, as if the building itself was being pulled by an invisible force. Each step felt heavier, and the feeling that she was trapped became more intense. She was running, but at the same time she was paralyzed, as if time itself had closed in around her. She tried to ignore the growing sense of despair, trying to stay calm as she ran back, but panic had already set in. The clock seemed to be getting closer, heavier every second, as if the hands were spinning faster. She looked down the hallways. They all looked the same, all leading her to the same place, the same reception, the same starting point. Time was closing, and with each new attempt to escape, she found herself closer to what she already knew was destined to happen. She no longer knew how much time had passed. The clock now read 4:15 minutes in the morning. The point at which destiny seemed to be fulfilled, the moment she had already seen in the medical records. The reality around him was disintegrating. The reception, the clock, the doors, the hallway. Everything was collapsing in the same direction, as if there was no longer any escape. Mariana looked at the clock, now completely immersed in her presence, and terror took over her. She knew There was no longer any way to escape. The clock was in control now, and she was just watching what time had in store for her. The air seemed to become denser as she approached the clock, as if the weight of time had accumulated upon her, as if she were being watched by something beyond her understanding. Each second was heavier than the last, and fear dominated her. She didn't know what would happen at 4 hours and 17 minutes, but she knew it was coming to an end, and that she no longer had control over what came next. The clock now seemed, more than ever, an implacable judge. The room was freezing, time was standing still, and Mariana knew that destiny would be fulfilled. When the clock struck the scheduled time, she would feel the collapse happen. The moment she feared so much was about to come true. She couldn't move anymore. Her mind was about to give in to the pressure. The clock, in its deadly precision, was about to confirm what she could no longer avoid. Mariana was desperate. More and more, she felt like she was being swallowed by something she couldn't understand. The clock, the system, the predictions, everything seemed to point to something she couldn't avoid. She felt immense pressure on her chest, the air was thin, and panic was beginning to overwhelm her. Reality was crumbling around her, and she knew there was no more time, no more escape. The clock was immersed in her mind, like a specter that watched her, forcing her to accept her fate. Breathing fast, she ran to the medicine room, one of the only areas of the hospital where she knew she could hide, at least for a few minutes. She locked herself in, feeling the door close behind her with a heavy sound, almost like a final seal. She leaned against the wall, trying to calm herself, trying to shake off the feeling of despair that invaded her. Her mind was confused, and she knew she needed something to control the crisis that was about to happen. Trembling, she grabbed the tranquilizers from the shelf with shaking hands and swallowed them, trying to find some relief. But even with the pills starting to take effect, the fear didn't go away. He was there, with her, like a shadow. She looked at the small metal cabinet that stood in the room, her eyes automatically moving to the small glass window. As she looked at her reflection, what she saw made her feel cold inside. In the corner of the glass, clearly reflected, was the reception clock. She blinked her eyes, trying to process what she was seeing. It couldn't be. It couldn't be real. But there it was, clear and distinct, reflected in the glass window of the closet. The clock, the damn clock, now counting down. It was no longer a clock that kept time casually. It was now counting down that she couldn't avoid. 4 hours, 16 minutes, she murmured, eyes fixed on the window. The sound of counting seemed to echo in his mind. She couldn't move. 4 hours, 16 minutes and 30 seconds. She swallowed hard, dread consuming her body as time seemed to move with deadly precision. The seconds passed like a sentence, each one heavier than the last. 4 hours and 17 minutes. Time now seemed to be the only real enemy she had, and it was coming at a fast pace. The pain began to rise in his chest, slow and sharp. She tried to breathe deeply, but the feeling of pressure in her chest intensified, as if something was crushing her heart. It was a pain she had never felt before, a pain that seemed to tear the air, an unbearable pain. She placed her hand on her chest, trying to support herself against the wall, but her knees gave out and she sank to the floor. Panic took over her, the fear that what was written in her file would come true. The countdown wouldn't let her escape. The reception clock was so clear in her mind that she could hear it as if it were right next to her, every second ringing like a death knell. 4 hours and 17 minutes. The time has come. She felt the pain intensify even more, a tightness in her chest that made her lose her breath. She tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out, swallowed by the pressure that was taking over her body. She didn't know what was happening, but she felt the darkness approaching. She felt her body becoming heavier, her senses failing, as if she were being consumed by reality itself. Before passing out, the last thing she heard was a low whisper, coming from somewhere inside the room, something she couldn't identify. The voice was clear, as if it were a final confirmation. Now, everything is fine. And then, darkness enveloped her completely. The next morning, the hospital woke up to an eerie silence, heavier than usual. The staff on duty at the reception, who had arrived for the next shift, soon noticed what seemed to be a quieter, darker environment. The lights in the reception room were dim, as if the space itself was drained of energy. But what caught his attention immediately was the reception clock, which was stopped, not at the usual time, but at exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes. The same time that had been predicted for Mariana's death. The clock, which had always been reliable, was now motionless, the hands fixed, as if time had been stopped at that hour, at that moment. Something was deeply wrong. They approached the reception desk, looking for Mariana, who was supposed to be there for the shift change. But instead they found her body, lying next to the chair, in a position that suggested she had simply dozed off. His eyes were closed and there were no signs of struggle or distress. She seemed to be in a deep sleep, too peaceful for someone who had faced the hours of terror she herself had experienced. What disturbed them most, however, was the fact that there was no sign of injuries, no evidence that anything tragic had happened. She was there, motionless, as if she had fallen asleep during her shift. However, upon checking the table, they noticed an even more unusual detail. There was an old paper on the counter, something that didn't belong there. It was a form filled out by hand, in Mariana's handwriting. His name was written at the top, but what really caught his attention was the note next to it. Time of death, 4 hours and 17 minutes. The date was absent, which made the note even stranger, as if time had escaped it, as if Mariana's death had already been registered in some way before it even happened. The paper seemed like an artifact from a distant past, from a time that shouldn't have been there, not at that moment. Those on duty were perplexed, unable to understand what they were seeing. There were no digital records of Mariana's file. The system, which normally kept everything recorded in detail, was empty. No input, no history. Only Mariana's file had disappeared. She was no longer registered in the system, as if her presence had been erased. The machine, which was once a witness to everything that happened in the hospital, was now silent, as if the world was denying the reality of its existence. Time seemed to have stopped for them at that moment. The clock on the wall, the lights off, Mariana's body there, so calm without signs of suffering. All these elements combined to create a feeling that something much bigger was happening. Something they couldn't understand, but that seemed impossible to ignore. The morning passed without anyone being able to find an explanation for what happened. The medical records that should have been updated had not been done, and Mariana's file, which should have been there, was nowhere to be found. All that remained were the handwritten words, the form with the time of his death but no date. As if time had been manipulated, as if everything was out of place, as if the clock had been a warning, a sentence that was served in a cycle that could not be broken. Mariana's colleagues, who knew her well, were shaken, unable to understand what had happened. No rational explanation could make sense of what was before them. The card, the watch, the paper. Everything seemed to have become a fragment of a distorted reality, where time didn't behave as it should. Mariana's destiny, which seemed already written, was now recorded incompletely, lost in the void of a hospital where timelines crossed in an erratic and irreversible way. The mystery was never solved. Mariana's record never appeared in the system again, and the reception clock never worked again. The workers on duty tried to continue with their work, but the hospital was never the same again. The time of 4 hours and 17 minutes, marked forever, became a reminder that time in the hospital no longer followed known rules. He had distorted himself, and with him, reality itself. Early morning at the market was calm, as always. The 24-hour store seemed to be a solitary refuge in the heart of the night, far from any activity. Excessive white lighting made the hallways cold and impersonal, creating an environment that seemed eternally caught between day and night. The constant hum of the refrigerator echoed through the store, interrupted only by the ticking of a clock near the register, which seemed to measure time relentlessly, as if each second passed endlessly. In the far corner, a slow, old song played. In the background, a soft, almost forgotten melody that filled the void with a sense of melancholy. The employee, Marcos, was sitting at the counter, bored. He leafed through an old magazine trying to distract himself, or ran his fingers through his cell phone, scrolling through notifications without interest. There wasn't much to do at 3 in the morning in an empty market. Outside, the street was deserted, lit only by streetlights that cast long, eerie shadows on the sidewalk. The rhythm of the night seemed to accelerate the feeling of isolation, and Marcos knew that, if it weren't for the constant ambient music and the distant sound of the refrigerator, the silence would be unbearable. He looked up, distracted by movement in the corner of the store. There, in the background, near the product shelves, was a customer. He was standing motionless, staring at the shelves of cans and packages. Marcos frowned, finding it strange that the man didn't move, didn't take anything, just stood there, like a statue, staring at the shelves without blinking. It was an image that bothered him, but he tried to ignore it, convincing himself that maybe the client was just someone with a lot of free time. The client did not appear to realize that. He was being observed. Marcos, bothered by the strange scene, tried to focus on the magazine again, but the customer was still there, inert, as if he was waiting for something, or maybe he was just a man lost in his own thoughts. The hum of the refrigerator and the ambient music now seemed more distant, as if time had slowed down and the market had become even emptier, more unusual. Marcos looked up once again. The client was in exactly the same place. He hadn't moved an inch. The ticking of the clock next to the cashier became more present, filling the air with its sound. Marcos took a long sigh and finally decided to go to the customer. The store seemed quieter than ever, and a strange feeling enveloped him. He stood up and walked slowly down the halls, his footsteps echoing on the cold floor. The music, with its slow rhythm, seemed to heighten the feeling that something wasn't right. Upon arriving close to the customer, Marcos cleared his throat, trying to break the silence, and said in a low voice, "Can I help you with anything?" But to his surprise, the customer didn't respond. It didn't move. He didn't look at him. He remained there, inert, without reaction. Marcos took a step forward, closer to the man, and once again tried to interact, but as he did so, the customer simply disappeared. There was no movement. There was no sound. He didn't walk away or hide. He just wasn't there anymore. Marcos stood frozen, eyes widening as he tried to understand what had just happened. The client was gone, as if he had never existed. Scared, with his heart racing and his mind confused, Marcos ran to the security room. He needed to see the cameras. He needed to understand what was happening. He entered the room in a hurry, pressed the monitor buttons to access the recordings, and began to observe the images. The market was empty, the camera showing the store, in the same way as always, except that the customer had never entered. He looked for the entrance cameras, for movement at the doors, but nothing. There were no signs of the man. He had never been through the market doors. Sweat began to run down Marcos's forehead as he looked back at the camera images in search of any explanation. The recordings were clear, and he searched the previous hours, the previous minutes, but the man had not been recorded at any point. He didn't go in, but he was there, in the background with disconcerting precision. Marcos didn't know what was happening, but the feeling that something was deeply wrong was intensifying. The image of a customer who never entered the store, but who was there, watching, hovered in his mind, and the music, still playing softly, in the background now seemed more ominous, as if time was manipulating the reality around him. He knew that this was not a simple illusion. Something, or someone, was manipulating what he saw. And deep down, Marcos had known that, in that market, time didn't behave the way it should. Marcos was bored as always that morning. The 24-hour market had its ups and downs, but in the early hours of the morning, all he could do was pass the time, waiting for the next customer. The silence of the store was filled only by the constant sound of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock next to the register. The ambient music played a slow song, and the hum of the freezers seemed to spread throughout the empty space. The market seemed to be in a suspended state, almost impervious to time. The street outside was deserted, and Marcos was starting to lose track of how much time had passed since he started his shift. He was, as usual, scrolling through his cell phone when something made him look up. A customer, He was standing between two shelves at the back of the store. Marcos frowned, confused, because the man didn't seem to be actually doing anything. He was there, in an awkward position, but he wasn't looking at the products on the shelves. His back was neither to the shelves nor facing them. He was off to the side, almost as if he was frozen mid-gesture, about to reach for something but not moving, not taking any action. Marcos watched the man for a few minutes, waiting for him to move, for him to pick up some product or make some gesture that would make him more real. But the customer didn't move. He didn't touch anything. He didn't turn his face away. It didn't blink. He was simply there, standing still, in a static but strangely uncomfortable position. The fact that the man was so still, that he didn't show any reaction, made the store seem even more empty, more distant. The ticking of the clock and the distant sound of the refrigerator seemed to intensify as time passed, and Marcos's feeling of discomfort increased. The client was on the sidelines, but there was no way to understand what he wanted, what he was doing there. Marcos then felt a slight frustration grow inside him. Maybe the man was just waiting for something. Or maybe he was just a normal, indecisive customer. But there was something about the way he was standing that seemed wrong. The market was empty. It was early morning, and he still hadn't seen anyone come through the door except that man. Perhaps he was just waiting for the right moment to get the product he wanted. But it seemed like time was dragging on as he remained motionless. The employee tried to convince himself that it was just a coincidence, that perhaps the man was indecisive or distracted, but the strange feeling did not disappear. He got up and walked over to the nearest shelf, trying to act like everything was normal, but his eyes couldn't move away from the customer. With every step he took, he expected the man to move, to grab something from the shelves, but he remained fixed. It was almost as if the man was frozen in time, in space, in a pause that made no sense. Marcos looked back at the client, trying to hide the growing feeling of discomfort that was taking over him. Something was wrong, but he didn't know exactly what. The market seemed calm, but there was tension in the air, as if the place itself was waiting for something. He got a little closer to the customer, waiting for him to react to his presence, but nothing happened. The man remained standing still, motionless, like a living statue, but without life. Marcos swallowed hard and finally decided to do what seemed like the obvious: ask if the customer needed any help. "Can I help you with anything?" he asked, his voice lower than usual, trying not to break the silence. But the man didn't respond. It didn't move. He didn't look at him. The store seemed quieter than ever. It was as if time had somehow slowed down, as if the movement of the world had stopped at the exact moment that man stood there, still, as if he was waiting for something that wouldn't come. Marcos felt even more uncomfortable, and the feeling that something wasn't right intensified. He took another step towards the customer, still waiting for the man to move, to at least look at him, but nothing happened. It was as if the client were part of the decoration, an impossible figure who did not belong to that reality. Marcos looked around, feeling the environment becoming heavier, denser. Every second that passed seemed to increase the discomfort. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know why the man was there, but something made him feel like he shouldn't be. He looked at the customer once more, trying to understand, but the image of a man standing motionless began to become even more unsettling. Time was dragging. The clock seemed to slow down. The hum of the refrigerator seemed more distant. The man was there, and Marcos felt like he was in a nightmare that he couldn't control. Something was about to happen, but he didn't know what. The store, the customer, the silence. Everything seemed to align towards something he couldn't predict. Marcos tried to shake off the growing discomfort that consumed him. Something was wrong with that customer, but he couldn't understand exactly what it was. The feeling that he was being watched, that the man was not there naturally, was becoming unbearable. He rose from his chair, trying to convince himself that perhaps he was exaggerating, that the early morning silence was affecting his judgment. But even so, he couldn't take his eyes off the customer who continued to stand between the shelves, motionless, as if time had stopped for him. The store was silent except for the sounds of the refrigerator and the soft hum of background music. The clock on the wall, as always, marked the time, but it seemed to drag on as if the hours were stretching out in that lonely dawn. Marcos took a deep breath, and with a feeling of obligation, decided that he needed to get closer to the client. Maybe he was waiting for something, or maybe he needed help, and Marcos didn't want to feel like he was ignoring something important. He walked through the silent halls, his footsteps echoing on the cold floor of the market. The store seemed emptier than ever, and the atmosphere, with its white lights and soft music, was beginning to become oppressive. Time seemed to be at odds with reality, with Marcos's every step becoming heavier, as if he were walking towards something he couldn't identify, something he didn't know how to face. As he rounded the last corner of the hallway toward the man, the store seemed even stranger. The customer was no longer there. He approached the exact spot where the customer had been, but the space was empty. No shelves moved, no clue that anyone had touched it. The man had simply disappeared. There was no sound of footsteps, no door opening, no movement to indicate the customer had left. He hadn't missed any of the security cameras. The market was still empty, but not in an ordinary way. It was as if the client had never existed. Marcos looked around, his eyes running along the shelves down the hallway, trying to understand what had happened. He forced himself to breathe, his heart beating faster. He had just seen the man there, and now he was gone. He hadn't walked out the door, he hadn't passed the security cameras, and there was no sign that he had moved. How was this possible? Where did he go? Was it a trick of the mind? Was he imagining that? But as he looked once more at the empty hallway, he knew he wasn't imagining anything. Something was happening, something he didn't understand. He returned to the security camera area, desperate to understand. The images were clear, and he watched carefully, but there was no sign of the man entering, leaving, or moving. Just the empty store. The same scene he had seen when the customer was standing there, but now, the emptiness seemed even deeper, even more disconcerting. There were no records, no signs of what had happened. Marcos felt the tension increase, as if he was involved in something much bigger, something beyond his control. The feeling, that time was stretching, distorting, seemed to intensify. The market now seemed like a strange, uninhabitable place. The clock still told the time, but the ticking seemed out of step, as if time had become out of step with the world around it. The 24-hour market seemed to have transformed into something unrecognizable, as if it were a space that existed outside of logic. Marcos passed his hand over his forehead, trying to cool down. He felt incredulous, like he was beginning to doubt his own sanity. The client, the feeling that something was wrong, the fact that he had simply disappeared. It was all becoming unbearable. He looked at the clock again and felt a wave of discomfort. He no longer knew if what was happening in the market had any logical explanation. It felt like time was becoming a prison, a distortion he was trapped in, unable to escape. He decided to take one last look at the security cameras. But before he could do so, the background music suddenly changed. What was once a slow, gentle song now seemed distorted, as if it was becoming more and more distant. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, more unbearable, and the light from the lamps began to flicker, almost imperceptibly. Marcos closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the situation. But when he opened his eyes again, the feeling that he was trapped in a cycle, in a distorted reality, only increased. Where was the man? What had he seen? The market, the store, the aisles. Everything seemed to be disintegrating around him. He didn't know what was happening anymore, but he knew he was experiencing something that didn't make sense, something that should never have happened. And no matter how hard he tried to understand, the answer was nowhere to be found. Marcos was in shock. The customer he had seen at the back of the store seemed to have disappeared without a trace. He felt an urgent urge to understand what had happened, to find some rational explanation for what he was experiencing. But with each step he took, the discomfort increased, and the feeling that time was distorting within the market intensified. He didn't know what to think anymore. The man had not walked out the door, had not been captured on any security camera entering or leaving. The void in the market seemed even deeper, and he was starting to feel trapped inside some kind of unchanging cycle. Determined to solve the mystery, Marcos left the camera room and began searching the market. He went to the bathroom, a small area hidden behind a windowless door. The place was empty, the only dim light coming from a lamp that hung from the ceiling, illuminating the dirty floor. There were no signs of the customer there, nothing out of place. He passed through the stockroom area, where the shelves were stocked with products still untouched. The boxes were organized without any movement, without any sign that anyone had passed by. The market was silent, except for his own footsteps echoing on the cold floor. Marcos went down to the disposal area, where the trash was stored before being taken out. The smell of expired products and crumpled packaging was strong, but still, there were no signs that anyone had hidden there or made any movement. The market was, in fact, empty. There was no one. Feeling a wave of frustration and discomfort, he returned to the counter. He glanced at the security camera monitor, deciding to check the recordings once again. He knew something wasn't right. Something was hidden in the images. Something he hadn't been able to see the first time. He began rewinding the recording, moving forward and backward through the images, trying to capture any detail that might explain what was happening. The market was empty at the beginning of the recording. The cameras recorded the store entering, normally with the door opening but nothing unusual. Then he saw it. The customer was there. In the recording, the man was standing in the same place as before, between the shelves. But there was something deeply disconcerting about the image. He was not shown entering. He was simply already inside the store when the recording started. The client was motionless, as if he had appeared out of nowhere. There was no sound of the door opening. There were no footsteps. There was nothing. He was simply there, standing, looking at the shelves with the same rigid, frozen posture. There was no movement. There was no reaction. Marcos rewinded the recording, moving forward again to the beginning to see if he could catch any other details, but the images were the same. The client was in the same place, motionless, on his side, as if time had stopped for him. He adjusted the viewing of the images, looking for any clue that might indicate how the man had gotten in, but nothing appeared. The door didn't move. The entrance registered no one. The man was simply there as if he had been there all along. Marcos felt a chill run down his spine. He fast-forwarded to the recording from previous nights in a desperate impulse to understand the pattern. He started going night after night, reviewing the images, but the result was always the same. Every recording, every previous night, the man was there, in the same spot, standing in the same position. Each time the recording started, the customer was already in the store, motionless, in a gesture that was never completed. The clock on the market wall always showed the same time. The client seemed not to move, as if time had no effect on him. Every night, the same thing. Same point. The same posture. Marcos turned away from the monitor, sweat running down his forehead. He looked around as if expecting something to reveal itself in the empty store, but nothing happened. The market was as quiet as ever, but dread took hold. What he was seeing on the cameras didn't make sense. How could the man just be there, without entering, without being registered? How could he be at every recording, every night, without anyone seeing him enter? He looked again at the clock, whose hands seemed to continue their indifferent march. But now he knew something was deeply wrong. The client was not a simple consumer. He was not someone who simply passed by the market. He was a constant presence, a static figure who somehow belonged there, as if he were a part of the market that no one could see. Marcos felt that the reality around him was distorting, and the doubt that perhaps he was trapped in a cycle that he could not break was growing, with no answer, no way out. Marcos could no longer ignore the feeling of restlessness that consumed him. He had watched the recordings repeatedly, but each time he looked at them, the stranger the images seemed. The man, that mysterious customer, always there, standing motionless between the shelves. But now, something was starting to bother him deeply, something he hadn't noticed before. He decided to pause and enlarge the image, trying to examine the details that had previously seemed irrelevant. The images, although low resolution, still had something peculiar about them. He enlarged the image of the client, observing more carefully. His heart raced. What he realized made him shiver. The man, although visible, cast no shadow. In a well-lit store like that, with incessant white lights, It was impossible for a figure to be completely shadowless. Where there should have been an outline of light and darkness, there was only the figure of the man, standing static, without any hint of shadow on the ground. Marcos blinked, not believing what he was seeing, and then forced himself to look closer. The image didn't change. The customer was there, but there was no shadow behind him. With a chill running down his spine, he rewinded the recording, trying to focus once more. He checked the camera to make sure it wasn't a glitch in the footage, but the image was clear. The customer was there, and he had no shadow. An uneasy feeling came over him, something strange and ineffable, as if he were looking at something that shouldn't be there. But it couldn't be, right? It was just a defect in the image, or maybe he was seeing what wasn't there. Marcos's mind began to enter a state of denial, as if he was trying to push away the idea that this was real. He couldn't stop looking at that image. Each time he enlarged the image, he became more convinced that something was wrong. But then he noticed something else. In the following recordings, the client, although still, seemed to change position slightly. Each night, he moved a little closer to the central corridor. Not abruptly, but in a subtle movement, as if it was slowly approaching the camera, somehow becoming more evident as the days passed. The customer was always there, but now he seemed to be moving toward the center of the store, closer to Marcos, closer to the center aisle. And, most unsettling of all, the customer always seemed to be looking at the camera. In each of the recordings, his eyes were fixed, directed towards the lens, as if he knew he was being observed. The movement of approaching slowly and, at the same time, keeping that gaze fixed, disconcerted Marcos even more. He felt increasingly uncomfortable, as if he were being pulled into something he couldn't control. The idea that the man was not only aware of the camera's presence, but was also getting closer, made the air around Marcos feel thicker. He progressed through the recordings, trying to understand if there was any pattern in the client's movement, but there was no reasonable explanation. The man did not appear to move spontaneously. On the contrary, its position changed very subtly, but always moving closer to the center of the store. The gaze fixed on the camera was also constant. It wasn't as if he was just an ordinary customer shopping, but as if he was waiting for something, as if he had been placed there for a purpose that Marcos didn't understand. Every time the client moved, even slightly, it felt like something was changing, and a feeling that time was being manipulated came over him. Marcos was now more apprehensive than ever. He no longer knew what to do with the images. The store seemed to be becoming more and more oppressive, and the customer seemed more like a presence than a real person. He turned away from the screen, breathing deeply, trying to calm himself, but the weight of what he was seeing wouldn't leave his mind. Something was happening there, and he didn't know what it was. He felt that the man was watching not just the camera, but himself, as if he was waiting for something. Something Marcos couldn't understand. With each passing night, the customer moved closer to the center of the store, and with each new recording, his gaze seemed more penetrating, more aware. Marcos tried to ignore it, but he couldn't. Something was building before him, a cycle he couldn't escape. The store was empty, but the customer was always there, closer than he ever imagined. The discomfort now became unbearable. He knew this wasn't normal. He knew something much bigger than he could understand was happening. The customer was not just a customer. He was a presence. And with that, Marcos felt that his sanity was beginning to dissolve, as the recordings became more and more sinister. Marcos was increasingly uncomfortable with what he was seeing on the recordings. Last night had been the strangest yet. He had already reviewed the images several times, but each time he watched them, the more he felt himself being pulled into a reality that didn't make sense. The man standing motionless at the back of the store was something he couldn't ignore. But now, in last night's recording, something even more disturbing was happening. At the end of the shift, when Marcos was heading towards the warehouse, the camera captured his steps as he walked to the door. The store was silent, and the customer, as always, was there in the same position, between the shelves. He remained motionless, like a statue, staring into space. Marcos, in fact, was already used to this image, but something happened that made his heart race. As he walked away toward the warehouse, he didn't notice it right away, but the camera recorded movement. The customer, who until then had remained static, turned his face away for the camera lens. He did so with a slowness that seemed surreal, as if he had freed himself from some kind of immobility. The movement was subtle but undeniable. Marcos was paralyzed when he saw this. The customer, who had not moved for hours, was now looking directly at the camera, as if aware of its presence. Marcos felt a chill run down his spine, the feeling that something was deeply wrong intensifying. The man, now with his gaze fixed and cold, looked like a specter, something that shouldn't be there. The penetrating gaze made the store even more disconcerting, as if the customer knew exactly what Marcos was doing, what he was observing. It was a look of pure awareness, but at the same time, something that didn't seem human. But the worst part came soon after. During the recording, the camera began to lose signal, an unexpected failure that only lasted 3 seconds, but it was enough to make Marcos panic. When the signal returned, the customer was gone. It wasn't there anymore. What once seemed like a moment of revelation now became more proof that something inexplicable was happening in that market. Marcos, now with his hands shaking, looked at the images once again, trying to understand what had happened. What he had witnessed did not seem real. The customer was gone, but he knew he couldn't have left. There were no doors or windows through which he could have exited in such a short time. And most disturbingly, he had simply disappeared at the exact moment the camera lost signal. Marcos's body was immersed in a fear that he no longer knew how to control. He had seen something he couldn't explain, and the feeling that time and reality were being manipulated seemed more and more concrete, but the worst was yet to come. He looked back, feeling the air grow heavier, as if someone was watching him. An impulse made him turn quickly. And there he was, the customer, back in the same place, but now closer to the cashier. The man, previously distant, was now a few meters away from Marcos. His gaze still fixed, still penetrating, as if he had silently moved closer without anyone noticing. The feeling that the client did not belong to that reality, that he was not a simple client but something completely different, intensified. Marcos felt powerless to move. He knew that somehow this wasn't right. The customer was not just physically present, he was moving at a tempo that didn't fit with the flow of the store. He was getting closer to Marcos in an impossible way. The man's gaze now seemed more menacing, more aware of his presence, more real than ever. Marcos didn't know what to do. He felt fear take over his body, but at the same time, he felt a sense of helplessness. He couldn't escape that place, that man. He knew that somehow the customer would always be there, watching, waiting. The store's clock was still running, its normal ticking, but time seemed to be distorting around it. Each second dragged on more slowly, as if everything was being manipulated by something bigger, something that didn't obey the laws of logic. And Marcos knew, with a deep chill in his soul, that he was trapped in that cycle. The client, that strange, motionless man, would never leave, and he too seemed destined to be trapped in that store, forever. Marcos's heart was beating hard in his chest and he could barely breathe. What was happening in the market seemed to intensify by the minute. He had seen the customer move closer to the register, but now he could no longer ignore what was happening. Something was definitely wrong. The man, with his fixed, unmoving, penetrating gaze, seemed to be approaching him in an almost supernatural way. The store was becoming more and more oppressive, and Marcos felt like he was losing control of everything. The client's presence was constant pressure, and he knew he needed to act. He ran to the security room, his body tense and his muscles almost locked with fear. As soon as he entered, he locked the door behind him, trying to isolate himself, trying to create a little distance between himself and that strange being. But at the same time, he knew it was somewhere he could no longer understand. The market was becoming a prison, and he no longer knew how to escape. With hands shaking, he turned on the monitors in the security room, trying to remain calm. He needed to see the cameras live. He needed to understand what was happening. The images appeared, but what he saw made no sense at all. The customer was there, exactly where he had seen him before, in front of the cashier. But the image was completely distorted. The man's face was blurred, and the outline of his body seemed to falter. as if the camera was trying to record something that shouldn't be captured. The image was full of interference, rippling, as if there was an invisible force manipulating the images. Marcos blinked several times trying to clear his vision, but he couldn't. The client was there, but the image was crumbling before his eyes. He looked at the monitors, increasingly confused, trying to find some explanation. But it was when he picked up the radio that the real paranoia began. He pressed the button, trying to call for help, trying to confirm that it was all just a hallucination caused by fear. But instead of a colleague's voice, he heard a low, cold whisper that came from inside the radio. "You always saw me." Marcos's blood instantly ran cold. He stopped, completely paralyzed, not knowing what to do. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice he had heard on the recording, the same voice that seemed to have come from somewhere deep, as if the store itself had spoken to him. He didn't know if it was a trick of the mind or if what was happening here was real, but fear gripped him in a way he had never experienced. He looked at the monitors again. The customer's image, now even more distorted, as if the man was on another plane in another reality. He didn't know what he was seeing, but everything was falling apart. The constant hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, more distracting. The air in the security room felt thicker, heavier, as if the store itself was closing in on him. He looked at the camera, where the man was, and panic took over him. He didn't know what to do, but he knew he was completely alone, trapped in that store with something he couldn't control. He tried to fiddle with the radio again, but before he could do anything, the camera image flickered. The signal was lost, and the screen went completely black. The store was completely silent now, and Marcos knew the worst was yet to come. He stood up from his chair, shaking, looking around the security room. Nothing made sense. Everything seemed to revolve around him, as if reality itself was bending and distorting around him. He looked at the locked door, but he knew that what was behind that door wouldn't be enough to protect him. The customer was no longer just in the store. He was everywhere, in every corner, in every breath Marcos took. And then, the sound of the radio, again. But now, it wasn't coming from inside the room. It was coming from outside. Marcos looked at the door, but didn't dare open it. He was trapped there, and he knew that what awaited him on the other side was something he was not prepared to face. The client, who had previously been just a static figure, was now a living, conscious presence, and he knew that in some way, he had always been there. Marcos felt panic take over his body, but he couldn't move. He looked at the clock on the wall. He knew that, at that moment, time no longer mattered. He was no longer controlling anything. The store, the customer, the radio, everything was becoming a big prison with no way out. He was at the center of everything, and nothing made sense anymore. In the silence of the security room, he finally understood the truth. The client was never an ordinary person. He was always there, watching. And the moment he tried to escape, he knew that the real torment had begun. Marcos was in a panic. The air in the security room felt thick, stuffy, and the feeling that he was trapped in a nightmare grew with every second. The distorted image of the client he had seen on camera was seared into his mind. The whispered voice, as if it had come from somewhere far away, from somewhere beyond Marcos's control, was echoing in his head. He didn't know what else to do. He knew something was very wrong with the store, with the weather, with the customer, but he could no longer reason. All he wanted now was to get out. He glanced at the locked door of the security room. Something inside him was pushing him out. The fear was unbearable. With shaking hands, he took the key and turned the lock, feeling the cold metal against his fingers. The door opened with a low creak, and he stepped into the store's hallway. He was determined to escape, to get out of that damn store. But as he took his first steps, what he saw paralyzed him. The store was completely empty, darkness taking over the place. No lights, no sounds, as if it had never been opened. The space was completely silent, a stillness that seemed to defy reality. Marcos blinked, his feet feeling as heavy as lead. He looked around, trying to understand, but there were no more lighted shelves, no more cold aisles. Everything was dark, and the store seemed uninhabited, as if he were in a place that was no longer what he knew. He took a step towards the front door, but when he tried to turn the handle, he realized that the door was locked from the inside. It wasn't possible. He had left the security room. The door was open. How could it be locked now? He started banging on the door with his fists, screaming for help, but nothing happened. He was alone, completely alone, in a store that no longer seemed real. Fear consumed him, but he couldn't stop. With no other option, Marcos ran towards the back, determined to find another way out. He needed to get out of there. He needed to escape. Every step he took felt heavier, more difficult. He passed through dark corridors, past empty shelves, and the feeling that space was closing in on him only increased. Arriving at the back door, he tried to turn the handle, but again, the door was locked. Marcos pushed the door with all his strength, desperate, but it didn't give way. He was trapped. When he finally walked away, dejected, he looked at the security camera near the back door, not expecting to see anything other than the empty image of the store. But what he saw next made him freeze in place. On the camera screen, he saw himself. He was standing, exactly where the customer was before. Property, without blinking. As if he were the very frozen figure he had watched for so long. He was there looking at the camera just like the man, standing in a position he knew wasn't his choice. It was him, but it wasn't. He looked out of place, like he was a replica, a version of himself that was there, in the store, but not really. He was stuck in that place still, staring into the lens without any movement, without any sign of life. Marcos felt a wave of despair wash over him, and for a moment he tried to scream, try to move, but he couldn't. The reflection in the camera seemed to mock him, as if he were in a time prison, frozen in the same spot the client was in, not knowing how to get out, not knowing how to break the cycle. He looked at the empty place in the store. Fear and anguish now completely took over him. The client, that man who seemed to be so still, so inert, was not the real problem. The problem was that Marcos was now him. He was there, trapped in an endless cycle, stopped, motionless, and the store, now empty and dark, was his prison. He had become part of it, with no way out, no escape. The security camera, with its image of his own reflection, was the last thing he saw before everything disintegrated. The market, the customer, himself. Everything was lost in an endless distortion. And deep down, he had known that what he feared most was the simplest truth. He had always been there, and now he would never leave. The next night, the market was quiet, as if nothing had happened. The new employee, João, arrived for his shift with the feeling of normality that accompanied those who started working in the early hours of the morning. He entered, feeling the cold air conditioning and the silent environment that only a 24-hour market could provide. Outside, the street was still deserted, lit by streetlights that left long shadows on the sidewalks. The clock on the wall marked the exact time of his entry, and the constant sound of the refrigerator filled the air. João looked at the cashier, expecting to see records of previous transactions, but the station was empty. He looked around, feeling the loneliness that always surrounded night shifts. The ambient music played a soft, almost imperceptible melody, mixing with the hum of the fluorescent lights above. The environment seemed to be trapped in a limbo, between day and night, where time seemed to drag on and the market became a space isolated from reality. As he headed to the counter to do his first check of the shift, something caught his eye. He looked at camera 3, which showed a view from the back of the store, near the merchandise shelves. On the monitor, something was there, motionless. A figure, a customer, stood between the shelves, in exactly the same spot where the figure had been seen previously. But this time something was even stranger. The client was motionless as before, but there was no shadow, as if he were a part of the light, a form that had no substance. He didn't move, breathe, or make any gestures. It was just there, frozen in time. João blinked, trying to process what he was seeing. The customer, with his disturbing presence, was once again in the same part of the store, but the feeling he conveyed was even more unsettling. He didn't know what to think. It was as if the man was part of the store's decor, a reflection of something that didn't belong in that world, something that shouldn't be there. João moved a little away from the monitor, trying to eliminate the feeling of discomfort, but he couldn't. He looked back at the screen, once again focused on the image of the motionless figure between the shelves. Time seemed to slow down as he stared at the scene. The figure remained where it was, without any change. There was no movement, there was no expression. Just the image of a man standing still, without shadow, without life. But something even more disturbing happened. The system displayed new information on the digital timesheet. A new name was registered. João approached the computer, suspicious, and saw that the name on the timesheet was his. But the entry time was there, marked precisely at the beginning of the shift, but there was no exit time. The field that was supposed to indicate the end time was empty, without any data, as if he had never left the store. John frowned. He knew. He had arrived there to start his shift, but the name on the timesheet with no departure time seemed to indicate that something was seriously wrong. He looked back at the camera monitor. The figure was still there, unchanging, and he didn't know what else to do. The system was recording his name, but he knew there were no previous records of his entry. The discomfort began to turn into dread, and he felt the pressure increase, as if the market was becoming a prison, a place where time and reality were being manipulated. He looked around, trying to find a logical explanation for all of this. The store was empty. The register was empty. But the records in the system seemed to say something else. It was as if the market was frozen at some point in time, as if the rules of reality didn't apply there. He tried to pick up the radio to call someone, but just like the previous recording, he couldn't make a sound. He was alone, trapped in a place where time didn't seem to work the way it should. As he looked towards the back of the store, where the figure was still standing, João felt a sense of inevitability. The store seemed to extend beyond the limits he knew. The figure was there, and somehow, he knew it would always be there. The shadowless man, who seemed to be waiting for something, was not just a passing presence. He was part of that place, and John in some way was also becoming part of it. The feeling that the store was more than just a market began to wash over him. The customer, that motionless man, was not a simple customer. He was a part of the distorted time cycle that the market had become, and João was now part of it. He looked once again at the figure at the back of the store, his heart racing, and knew that no matter how much time passed, he would never be able to escape. The market had trapped him, and the shadowless client would be his company until the end.